Mr. McBrien. This is TGJ2O, Websites and Design. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of a website. I know we've already gone into that in some detail already, but it's going to give us additional insights into the design process for building a website, and we'll see that today. So a website, we have to avoid the mistake of thinking of a website as a pretty online essay. It's very different from that. At least it's much more. So a good website has excellent page layout. It has a user experience. It has organization of information, and it has very specific messaging. And all of these things have to be considered when we're designing our site. Now, it is useful for us to review the engineering design process, something that works across the development of any kind of new thing. And that design process is pretty consistent regardless of whether you're building a widget, a software program, or a website. So the first thing you want to do is collect information. You want to ask specific questions. Then you're going to use that information to establish a goal for your invention. Next, you're going to brainstorm how to achieve that goal. So you work with the stakeholders to establish what you want to build. Then you build that prototype. After you've built it, you begin the testing and refinement phase. So you try to work with it in the ways that you anticipate and see where it stands up and where it falls down. And where it falls down, you fix it. Finally, you release it, and your work's not done. At that point, you start to use analytics and other tools in order to decide how you're going to improve it. Decide what version 2 is going to look like. Now notice none of these arrows move in only one direction. At given times, we may have to move backwards in the process. It's not a linear process. Move back. Maybe ask new questions, build new prototypes, but ideally we want to move, for the most part, around this circle in a clockwise fashion. Now, when it comes to asking the questions, before we go to design a solution, we have to collect data. Now, in the case of a website, these data may include stakeholder interviews. Typically they will. Talking with the people who are commissioning the site. It may involve review of existing competitive solutions. Whether we want to make it better or just make it as good depends on our situation. And we may want to actually interview the target audience. We never want to neglect the target audience when we're building a site. Now, we've lumped two things into one here when we've talked about data collection. We may decide we want to separate those two things into defining the problem and research. So in one case, we work with the stakeholders, and in the other case, we may be doing a lot of work with the customers. Now, when it comes to defining the problem, when we begin our work, our situation might be that we don't have a lot of idea of what that problem is. And that's okay. The design process allows for this. But we will need to spend that time and make sure that the goal of our website is clear before we start brainstorming any solutions for it. Now, when that goal isn't clear, we have to make sure that it's defined before we move forward. So let's consider an example. Let's imagine that the robotics club wants us to build a website. Now, they might come to us and say, we got to have a website. And this is not unusual. It might seem like a silly ask in some ways. Now, but that is really not all that strange. You can hear this kind of request from even very sophisticated business groups and marketing groups. We got to have a website. Well, let's contrast that ask with this. We need a robotics club website to help inspire graduating grade 8 students to take grade 9 tech and join the robotics club in the fall. Now, which one of these makes it easier to start designing the website? And I think you know the answer to that. So that single sentence is an extremely valuable tool looking forward. And sometimes we have to drag that out of our stakeholders. Now, so when it comes to then that clarity of purpose, our goals, we need to make sure that we understand who the audience is, make sure we understand the goals of the stakeholders, and in many cases interview the audience. Try to figure out what gets them excited, what interests them. But ultimately, the goal of the website is to convince the audience to do something the stakeholders want. And that something is up to us to figure out. Now, when it comes to brainstorming, once we have our goals in place, once we understand our audience, we can start to say, okay, how are we going to build this thing? What's it going to look like? How's it going to feel? So we'll use everything we know to start to design our content. We've got to make sure that our messaging is clear. And then it'll start to help us to understand what we need to write, what we need to create, what we need to embed, or worst case scenario, what we need to link to from other places. Now, this brainstorming phase, we can propose a lot of different potential solutions if we want to, but we only want to develop the ones that get the thumbs up. Otherwise, we can spend a lot of wasted time on our tools. Now note though that when we are brainstorming this thing, when we're throwing together proposals, this doesn't mean we won't be going back. We may have to go back to the research phase to try to figure out whether our idea is feasible, whether our concepts resonate with stakeholders and customers. Now, once we've got our ideas in place, we can start to generate a prototype. Now, prototypes should be initially very simple. So we may not want to mock up a website first if we're simply looking for a color scheme and a page layout. We may want to do this in simpler tools. Or it may be just as fast to build a single page. Now, this leads us to another trap. Don't develop the entire website before the stakeholders give approval to things like layout and color scheme. Notice that the prototype is not for the public. So there might be certain test case users we might show it to, but primarily in the case of the website, we'll be showing this to stakeholders and having them approve it. If the stakeholders are the same as the developers, this is fine. We get together and we make sure we like things before we make them public. Now, we want to do some testing and evaluation. We want to check to make sure that there's no broken links, these kinds of things. We'll do that at the prototype phase. We'll go ahead and before we make our system live, we'll do some testing. How elaborate the testing is depends on the essentially on how elaborate the remit is. How elaborate is the website? Well, that'll define whether our testing takes 5 minutes or 5 days. Now, once we've gone public with our website, once we've released it, this doesn't mean that our testing and improvement phases are finished. We want to look at these things either as subsystems, so individual pages, or as a whole, the complete website, and continue doing development as we find ways to do things better. Now, when it comes to pre-release improvements, we want to try to keep these small. So we don't want to scrap everything and do a whole rewrite. Ideally, we'll go live with the site and then do enhancements as we go. Okay, so our project then, we're going to design a website working in pairs, and we're going to go through the entire design process. So we're going to document very briefly a fictitious business or charity. Then we're going to walk our way through the steps of the design process. So we'll document the goals of the website. We will profile our customer base. And then we'll create a design for the website from there. Use Google Sites to author the website. Don't forget to publish it when you're done. Thanks very much. Have a great night.